wait for it to. Okay, well, we're live, so I'll do. Welcome everybody. This is the live streaming channel of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum, which is a community group based in the Upper Blue Mountains of Australia, New South Wales, Australia. For some years, we've been organising public discussion forums on philosophical topics. Recently, we've branched out into aspects of political philosophy. And today, our topic is free speech in the Chinese Communist Party in Australia. And you'll see our speaker on my right on the screen is Clive Hamilton, a very well-known public intellectual, especially in Australia, who is the professor of public ethics at Charles Sturt University. He's held posts at Oxford University, Sciences Po, the University of Heidelberg, and Yale, and was founded the Australia Institute, which is a left-of-centre think tank in Australia, and for 14 years was director of it. He's had articles published in the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Scientific American, and The Guardian. Now, he's up until recently, Clive was best known for what he had to say in the work he'd done in the environmental area, especially climate change. But just in the last couple of years, he's taken a very deep interest in the influence operations of the Chinese Communist Party in the Western world. His first book, titled Silent Invasion, was focused on Australia specifically. But he's just published a new book, just came out on, I think, on the 20th of June, which is co-authored by a German China scholar by the name of Mareike Ohlberg, and it's called Hidden Hand. And that's it there. The subtitle is Exposing How the Chinese Communist Party is Reshaping the World. Now, I just finished reading this book, and it's an absolutely extraordinary book. The level of detail and comprehensiveness of the book is quite remarkable. And it's focused primarily on Chinese Communist Party influence operations in Europe and North America. It's kind of a companion volume to Silent Invasion, which was about Australia. And it is profoundly disturbing. I thought I had a sense of what was going on in this area, but what the book really makes very clear is the sheer scope and comprehensiveness of these influence operations, which really is, pose an extraordinary challenge, and in various respects represents a significant challenge to the structures of democratic governance in those countries which are heavily affected by it. So, with those words of introduction, I might start to pose a series of questions to Clive. Clive, I wonder if you could begin by, given that you were best known for your work on environmental issues, what drew you to delving into the area of Chinese influence, Chinese Communist Party influence operations?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Well, I mean, I never anticipated that I'd start to write books about CCP influence and the larger issues that I've been drawn into, the kind of geostrategic questions and so on. But it was really back in 2016. We read a series of newspaper reports in Australia about wealthy Chinese or Chinese Australian businessmen who'd become the biggest political donors to both of our parties. And then the reports by some really excellent journalists, there are only 4 or 5 of them, but they really started this whole thing back in 2016 or even 2015, if we think of the stories then being written by Beijing correspondents, in particular John Garneau and Philip Wen for the Fairfax Press, as it was then. They wrote some really extraordinary stories exposing the links of these wealthy donors to the Chinese Communist Party. And then the Sam Dastyari affair broke out, of course, and quite clearly, one donor in particular, one now banned from re-entering Australia because of his links to the Chinese Communist Party, had obviously got quite a hold over Sam Dastyari, and it led him even to give a speech to Chinese language media in Australia, effectively repudiating the Labor Party's position in the South China Sea. And so it's these stories that made me think, wow, there's something really big going on in Australian politics here. What is this? What does it mean? And I just finished another book, a third in a kind of trilogy on climate change, a book called Defiant Earth, which I'd sent off to the publisher. And I thought, I need another project. This seems to me to be exceptionally important. I'm going to write a book about it. Well, at least I thought I would. And so I did what anyone who's not an expert in an area does when they're starting out. I went to talk to the experts. So I met with about half a dozen of them around Australia and got the lowdown, which made me more alarmed and more fascinated. But also I asked them, well, then, somebody must be writing a book on this, someone better qualified than I. And they all said, no, you should do it, Clive. So that's how it started. And I had absolutely no idea then what I'd be getting myself in for.
Okay. One thing that you might like to enlighten us about is just the difficulties you had finding a publisher for the first book.
In November, October, late October, I think it was, 2017, I'd finished Silent Invasion. I wrote it in 11 months with a huge amount of work from a young Chinese-Australian researcher named Alex Josky, who's gone on to great things, brilliant young man. It was going to be published by Allen and Unwin, who had published some 8 of my previous books. Very close relationship with them. Very progressive publisher. When I put the idea to them a year earlier, they were exceptionally enthusiastic. They saw the value of it and the importance of it straight away. And then the book had been finished, had been edited, had been legaled, and it was about to go to page proof stage, due out early 2018. And I got a call and said, we're not going to publish it because we are afraid of retaliation from Beijing. And it shocked me deeply because at one level it was a disturbing affirmation in the most extraordinary way of the central thesis of the book. That is, the Chinese Communist Party in Australia, that they can even suppress a book critical of the Chinese Communist Party. And I was really, it really rocked me, because I'd been, suddenly I was out there alone. I thought I had a publisher behind me, but suddenly I was alone with a manuscript. And I thought, well, and it was a global story. It went everywhere, New York Times and the Times and, everywhere, in the German papers, the Japanese papers, BBC, you name it. It was a big story about free speech. And I thought, well, the publishing industry in Australia is going to beat a path to my door because they will see that this is going to be a bestseller. I mean, people love to read a book that's someone's tried to stop them reading. But the phone didn't ring from the other publishers in Australia. They ran a mile from it because they were scared too. And eventually I began to start looking overseas after several weeks because I couldn't find a publisher. But then someone suggested I approach Hardy Grant in Melbourne. And so I rang up Sandy Grant, the boss, and said, Sandy, I've got this book. You've read about it. Are you interested? He said, yeah, we want to publish it. We believe in free speech. We will publish it. And that's what happened.
Right. I wonder if you could, there's one issue which is probably worth addressing up front. I read your article in the Herald in December last year, where you described the reaction of some of your erstwhile colleagues who on the left, who thought this was a bit disturbed that you would take up this issue. But there's a broader question that you hear both from regime apologists on the left and the right who say, well, this is xenophobic and xenophobic, and in other words, they tend to conflate the Chinese Communist Party with China, Chinese culture, the Chinese people. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was an accusation thrown at me from, it seemed all sides when Silent Invasion was published. And, it was pretty upsetting being someone of the left who'd spent decades criticising racism and standing up for the oppressed and so on. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I set up a think tank. But, and I was very alert to it. And as soon as I started researching it, it was kind of the first. One of the people who I met first was John Garneau, and I had this meeting with him in the early stages of researching Silent Invasion. And I was just leaving. He said, Clive, it's really good that you are writing this book. And I said, well, why? He said, because you're from the left. I thought, oh, okay. And I didn't really realise what he meant until later, when the attacks started to come from the left. Because if I'd been, a conservative person from a conservative think tank, everyone on the left would have just dismissed the book as, another piece of Reds under the bed, etc. But, and I also spoke to my Chinese Australian friends and informants who helped me with the book. I said, the book's going to be attacked for this reason. And in fact, it's possible that racists in Australia will take it up to, justify their position. What do you think about that? And I remember a conversation I had with 2 or 3 of them, Chinese Australians who'd been helping me. And they said, well, what's the alternative? I mean, is the alternative to say nothing about CCP interference? I mean, these are the people who are the greatest victims of the CCP, of course, pro-democracy Chinese Australians and others, Uyghurs and Tibetans and so on in Australia. And so I was determined to make sure that in that book, and Marika and I do in this book as well, to make a very, very clear distinction between China and the Chinese people on the one hand and the Chinese Communist Party on the other. And this is about the Chinese Communist Party, about the ruling party and its activities. And what disturbs me about the way in which people on the left throw this accusation around as a way of discrediting me and discrediting the arguments is that they play directly into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party, which as a matter of ideology and political practice insists that it is the true representative of the Chinese people, and that therefore, since the party is the people, criticism of the party is an attack on the people and therefore racist. I mean, they use this trope constantly throughout their propaganda around the world. It's deeply racist.
This will be very distressing to Chinese people.
Yes,
if you say that, that's a common formula.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. You hurt the feelings of the Chinese people, and it is true that some Chinese people do identify strongly with the Chinese Communist Party, and undoubtedly their feelings are hurt. But I don't really care. I mean, I care about the Chinese people and the Uyghur people and the Tibetan people and the Hong Kongers who are oppressed by this authoritarian party. They don't feel that at all. And that's why the book has been greeted very warmly by the Chinese diaspora, or elements of the Chinese diaspora in Australia, why the book was published in Chinese translation in Taiwan, why the book has been, Silent Invasion, is published in Japanese and was an incredible bestseller. I mean, it was only published 2 months ago. And when I go to Taiwan, or when I speak to Japanese people who want to talk to me about the issue, and I say, I've been accused of being racist and xenophobic in writing this book in Australia, and they're just mystified. Then why? You know, they just don't get it. And yet we have this kind of history of what I call xenophobia, the terror of being accused of being racist, and the kind of competition on the internet and elsewhere amongst tankies, as they're known, the kind of ultra left, as to who can be more anti-racist than the other person, a kind of performative wokeness that is out there. So, yeah, I completely reject this accusation, although it has stuck, and many people, well-meaning lefty people, decided that they would have nothing to do with this book and these arguments because, you know, they were convinced by the early attacks, well orchestrated and very effective from a range of people, on the book as racist, which of course the CCP loved and quotes and uses all the time. So just let me finish on this point. I think what it betrays, and I think a lot about this and have written about, as you alluded to, Peter, I think it betrays a really serious problem that large elements of the left have. I should say that there are plenty of people on the left who completely get it, completely agree. They can see the threat to democracy, the repressiveness of this regime, and that any person worth their salt on the left will campaign against it. But there are plenty on the left who have a serious ideological problem, and they are in effect working in the interests of a very powerful, very repressive authoritarian regime, and that troubles me.
Yes, and it just doesn't just come from the left, does it? You've got the business interests and certain university vice chancellors and so on who, say things like this is a reversion to the white Australia policy and this sort of thing.
Yeah,
and people who have a clear interest in placating the regime.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. One prominent vice chancellor dismissed the whole debate about CCP influence in Australia and so on as, what was his phrase? Xenophobic blathering. Yeah,
I remember.
Michael Spence at the University of Sydney, who is the most publicly apologetic person amongst VCs, amongst senior academics for the CCP, and so the business people come at it differently. They tend not to, and the foreign affairs doves. They don't wheel out the xenophobic argument. They just talk about basically we need to appease Beijing because it's in our interest to do so. And of course, this is really a product of neoliberalism and business interests. I mean, if you believe that the only thing that really matters is the economy, then you don't want anything to happen that will upset Beijing, because I notice this coming out, for example, often from Andrew Lee, my local member here in Canberra, constantly making the arguments about, this China debate, it's really not in our interest because he's an economist and his whole thinking is conditioned by that. And the business people, of course, are on the same track.
Yeah, if we can just change emphasis a bit. In the book, you give a very comprehensive description of if you like, the ideology, the current ideology of the CCP. One thing you often hear, particularly from business types, is that really China's not communist anymore. But I read the book by Richard McGregor, The Party, a few years back, where he makes the point that you've got a sort of a grafting of a Leninist political structure on a partly marketized economy. It's a new kind of hybrid that we haven't seen.
Yeah.
But reading your book, I was reminded of my misspent teenage years as a teenage Maoist. And I actually read the selected works of Mao, and on contradiction, his distinction he made between contradictions between within the people, which are in some sense legitimate, and contradictions between the people and the enemy, which is, there's no tolerance to be exercised there. And I thought that was quite amusing. But it's striking that ideology, despite this supposed, partial marketisation of the economy is still so prevalent.
Yes.
But you talk a lot about, and this is a regime term in their internal deliberations, discourse power, which I thought was very interesting. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is absolutely fascinating and so important in understanding what China under the CCP is about. The CCP, for the CCP, the Cold War never ended. And they were appalled when the Soviet Union collapsed. That was in a way a greater shock to them than the Tiananmen Square massacre, both events in 1989. And they blamed Gorbachev for allowing Western ideas and relaxing ideological control for the collapse of the great Soviet Union. And they determined that would never happen to them. And so although we have been inclined to think that with the Deng Xiaoping's opening of China to the international market, integration of the WTO and so on and so forth, that they've become far more pragmatic and less ideological. This is completely false. The party, particularly under Xi Jinping, is an intensely ideological beast. And the party believes, and they say this constantly, that they are engaged in a life or death ideological struggle with the West. For them, it's a battle of ideas. For the party, ideas really matter. I think it was in Silent Invasion, I quoted, it's one of those apocryphal comments, I think, that said to have come from Stalin, that, ideas are more powerful than guns. We don't allow our enemies to have guns. Why should we allow them to have ideas? And that's how the CCP works in China. And the other fallacy is we're inclined to think, well, CCP terribly repressive and bad things. It does bad things in China, but we can't do anything about that. But in fact, what the CCP is doing is exporting its ideology and its mechanisms of control to the rest of the world. I mean, that's what our book is about, and what Silent Invasion was about, how it's doing this and why it's doing this. And one of the central concepts here is this idea of discourse power or discourse control. And Marika Olberg, my co-author, is a particular expert in this, because that's this kind of stuff. She wrote her PhD on. She's a sinologist of considerable repute. She knows this stuff. And so I've learned a great deal from her about this issue of discourse power, discourse control. And basically what the party does, and the theorists actually have studied Foucault on this to understand. Yeah, absolutely. And Joseph Nye on soft power.
I thought they stuck to Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao.
Oh,
obviously not.
No, Foucault is in the tradition. Well, because they want to understand how to use, to promote and use ideas to win the ideological struggle with the West. So if someone, whether it be Foucault or Gramsci, can help them develop the understanding and particularly the techniques, then they'll draw on it and turn it to their particular purpose. So discourse power is really in the context of the broader propaganda work or thought work, which they carry out in Western institutions like universities and think tanks. We have a whole chapter on think tanks and in the West, opinion makers, the media, of course. And the purpose of discourse power is to create what they call a favourable international public opinion environment. And so discourse power is really about creating the capacity to promote a CCP understanding and view of the world beyond China. And so they've been engaged in a really extensive and very subtle program of extending CCP discourse power to defeat, and I mean defeat, the so-called false ideological trends from the West, constitutional democracy, the notion of universal values, civil society, Western principles of journalism. These are the enemies of the party's power. And so this is what they mean, the party theorists and the party leaders, when they talk about developing and increasing the party's discourse power abroad.
I think one distinction between the situation we face today and the Cold War period is that in the Cold War period, the two blocks were not quite hermetically separated economically and so on, but they was pretty close. Whereas nowadays, because of the very close trading relationships and so on, there's an intertwining. It's right within the interstices of our society, and that you see a more sophisticated approach to exercising discourse power because of the large number of Western educated people who've gone through the university system here and can identify kind of pressure points. You were talking earlier about the way the left often has this kind of knee-jerk reaction of seeing racism everywhere, so that they plug right into that. But reading your book again, I was struck by the sheer comprehensiveness of the areas of influence. There's the education systems. There's the very powerful connections into key Wall Street. Some of the major actors in Wall Street. The business elites, the cultural elites, and book publishers, which you mentioned in the book that many of them actually have their books printed in China because they do it cheaper. The scope of it all is quite remarkable. Could you perhaps elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, I'll try a bit.
So you'll be here all day, but
this is one person I spoke to early on, actually, when I was writing Silent Invasion. Somebody very familiar with what was going on and the kind of intelligence area described what the CCP was up to in Australia, and of course is applying in other countries as well, which is what this book about. I described it as a full court press, and I didn't quite know what this term meant. I had to look it up. It's a basketball term, and it means engage in an all-out offensive. And so, what I discovered was, when you start looking, and you have to know how to look and where to look, and you need help from people with expertise in various areas, is how the influence operations, including assertion of discourse power, is targeted at pretty much all of the institutions of Western democracy. So you've listed them and aimed at the elites there, because the elites, the CCP knows.
I forgot to mention political parties.
Yeah, it's kind of over and after them. The elites are the ones that make the decisions, have the power. So they are the targets, and they're political, they're business, they're academic, they're in the media, and kind of most fascinating one I didn't fully understand until I started researching this book with Marika was the cultural elites. And it's the one where you'd least expect to see it occurring. But when you start to track it and see what's been going on, you see a whole number of United Front linked companies and organizations. United Front Work Department is a department of the Communist Party, carrying out their influence work in cultural institutions in the West. So you'll find them in the New York Ballet, the Royal Opera, the Madrid Theatre. You'll see it at a lower scale with writers' festivals and film festivals, and you can start to see the oppressive hand of the Chinese Communist Party influencing what these cultural institutions stage in the case of theatres, what film festivals screen, and they engage in censorship under pressure from the CCP and its agencies. Writers' festivals, these are the paragons of free speech in the West, and of course Hollywood, where it's rife, as we know. And these are supposed to be. China under the CCP may not have much of its own soft power, but it has certainly infiltrated the institutions of soft power in the West and started to change the way they operate. And the one you mentioned was in book publishing. We talk a bit about this, both academic books and the way in which CCP has an influence over academics and academic publishing, but also all publishing, because who knew, but most publishers in Australia and the US and so on do a lot of their printing, a majority of their printing in China. They send the electronic copies to China. They get printed there, particularly any book that has color in it or something special, because China has developed the most sophisticated printing industry with all the best machinery. And it turns out that Chinese agents for these printing houses quietly circulate amongst Western publishers lists of topics and names and so on that cannot be mentioned in a book if they want their book to be published in China. And of course, it's something like 30% cheaper to have it done in China, and the quality is very good. So here's a form of censorship that's going on. So when publishing companies are commissioning books, they have this thing in their back of their head. We have these terms or this criticism or whatever in this book. We are going to have to pay an extra X% to have our book printed. And as it happens, one of the three reasons that Allen and Unwin gave for declining to publish Silent Invasion was that they thought, perhaps quite legitimately, that their printing costs would go up, not just for Silent Invasion, which they wouldn't have printed in China anyway, but for all of their other books. Because CCP Beijing could easily instruct all of the printing houses in China, do not publish any books from Allen and Unwin. So this was a factor in the decision of a Western publisher in deciding not to publish a book critical of the Chinese Communist Party.
And then there's the influence in Hollywood, where people making films have to think very carefully about what they're going to need to do to get access to that huge Chinese market.
And it's rife, and it's a very deep problem. For Hollywood films, something like close to half of their box office, depending on the film, is in China. And that gives Beijing huge leverage, because they just say, well, if you make a film about China's invasion of Tibet, or if you have a film that features the Dalai Lama or even mentions him, or any other hundreds of topics, Hong Kong, anything that we don't like, then sorry, we simply won't let it into China. And so there, the Hollywood producers think, well, that's half of our market gone. So what do? They don't make films like that. And there are some famous incidents where they've made films that, for some minor reason, have run afoul of the censors, and they edit it out, or they change it, or for example, there's a remake of Top Gun, and the Tom Cruise character, what's his name, Maverick. There's this scene where he's wearing his bomber jacket, and he has some stickers on the back of it, and one of them is a flag. Now I'm forgetting the details. It's the Taiwan flag or something like that, and it just flashes for a nanosecond across the screen, and well, that's out. It's had a deep impact, and there are now legions of stories about Hollywood producers and directors and scriptwriters getting together, and they're talking about making a film, and it's right up front, make sure there's nothing in this film that could offend Beijing. So there you have, probably Hollywood is the epicenter of United States soft power, isn't it? Has been for decades. Now it's controlled, it's censored, so that there's the artistic freedom is significantly constrained in a way that makes sure nothing that would offend the Chinese Communist Party gets made.
Right. And then there was the issue with the NBA team, where they were the head of one of the teams tweeted in support of the Hong Kong students and was quickly obliged to make a grovelling apology. Yeah,
because who knew? NBA is huge in China, and there are TV networks that screen it, party controlled, of course, and they just said, right, unless that person gives a grovelling apology for sending a tweet about supporting Hong Kong democracy protests, then that team's games will simply not be screened in China. Big financial cost, grovelling apologies forthcoming. So, and this is right through sport, or the kinds of sport that have an influence. There was a shocking case of Matt Horton's family, which was reported in the Weekend Australian magazine about 2 months ago. It's definitely worth looking up because it's deeply, deeply disturbing. Okay, so Matt Horton famously said that refused to take the podium when he came second to Sun Yang, the Chinese swimmer and big star in China, because he said he was a drug cheat because he had been caught with a sample that had banned drugs in it some 2 or 3 years earlier. Matt Horton became public enemy number one on Chinese social media. He himself received thousands of abusive and threatening emails, all kinds of things happened to him. But then what none of us knew was that his family, living, mother and father and young brother, living in Quiet Street in suburban Melbourne, had 2 years of hell where they were targeted in all kinds of ways. They had groups of people gathering outside their house at night and banging drums and shouting abuse at them. They had dog turds through the letterbox. They had cyber attacks. They had black vans parked outside their house, all kinds of things, broken glass thrown into their swimming pool, all kinds of, it was a terror campaign. And it was clearly orchestrated, I would say, by the consulate in Melbourne. They could have stopped it overnight if they'd chosen to. These people went through hell on Australian soil, you know. And it was only when in February, was it, that Sun Yang was banned from swimming for 8 years that the attack stopped. So this is how, you know, this is the reach of the Chinese Communist Party. You know, it's not just in China that the enemies of the party are persecuted and attacked. It's happening right here in Australia, and not just to people of Chinese heritage or Uyghurs in Australia, you know, not just people, non-white people, but even increasingly Anglo people who, for some reason, the party doesn't like, that are now coming under attack.
You talk in the book about the way the regime sees the role of the Chinese diasporas around the world, and people who obviously have, you know, you would expect to have the same range of opinions as any other group. You know, many of them, you know, no doubt would strongly support democracy, but people are being subjected to intimidation, aren't they? Particularly if they have family connections or business connections back into China. They're vulnerable to this. Yeah.
Well, as you say quite rightly, the Chinese diaspora in Australia, like all diasporas, is very diverse, you know, linguistically, culturally, and politically. And there's a portion of them, and it's very hard to determine what kind of proportion, who have absolutely no sympathy for the CCP, love living in a democratic country and enjoying the freedoms here, and are appalled and frightened by the presence of the Chinese Communist Party in Australia, because it's extremely intimidating. You know, there are MSS officers, Ministry of State Security, a sinister intelligence security organisation operating on the streets of Australia. And there have been several well-documented incidents of those people carrying out surveillance, intimidation, and so on. So, but there's also a portion of the diaspora that either likes the CCP or finds it in its interests to work in the interests of the CCP. And this is done mainly through the United Front network of party-linked organisations, and there are many such groups and individuals who are actively working in Australia in the interests of the Chinese Communist Party to erode the democratic processes in this country in a whole range of ways, which we talk about. One of the more recent ways in the last 5, 6, 7 years that started to emerge in Australia and elsewhere, and which we talk about quite a bit in the book, is a program known as Huaren Kanjang, which means, forgive my pronunciation, Mandarin speakers out there, which means, literally means ethnic Chinese participation in politics. And what we're seeing at the 3 levels of government in Australia is candidates for office, some of whom now have been elected to local government, to state governments, and even to federal parliament, who are effectively operatives for the Chinese Communist Party. They've been encouraged to run for office. They've been funded to run for office, supported to run for office by organisations and individuals who are linked to United Front organisations and the party itself. And so there's a deliberate program of placing trusted people, increasingly young people from the diaspora, into the political process, either as candidates or as staffers of political of politicians. This is a serious problem in all kinds of ways, and it was that which I think was behind the raid by the AFP, when was it, last Friday week, because of at least the way, I'm choosing my words carefully here, that it was reported in the press that it was believed that the raid followed an investigation into Chinese Communist Party interference in Australian politics.
Mm. You mentioned the United Front approach, and you described that extensively in the book, the structures that the regime has established and the role that they're expected to play both domestically within China and internationally. I wonder if you could just briefly touch on that. I mean, I know that's a huge topic.
Yeah, it is a huge topic, and in a way, it's the core of the book. The United Front work, which is the broad description for pro-CCP foreign, in this case, influence and interference work, which is centred on and in large measure managed by the United Front Work Department, although it exists outside and beyond the United Front Work Department, is the CCP's global program of influence organisations and techniques. And it's very broad in its application and very detailed in the way it goes about its work. And the basic principle, and of course United Front work arises out, it's kind of comes from the Comintern with the Soviet Union in the 20s, with early CCP leaders participating in that, and then was put into practice during the 1930s when the CCP was driven out of the cities by the nationalists and regrouped in the countryside, and decided that it should form a united front with as many non-CCP elements of society as it possibly could. That's the kind of origin of the idea, and it's now been applied in the modern day to build the broadest possible coalition against the main opponent, or the main enemy, by identifying people who could be recruited effectively to work with the party or party agencies, whether they know it or whether they know that they're doing it or not, in order to advance the interests of the CCP. And one of the ways it does it, as you say, it's a vast and, under Xi Jinping, extremely well funded network of organisations which reaches across China's borders into countries like Australia, and it's quite opaque, and it takes a huge amount of work to kind of figure out what it does and how it does it. But one of the things that we did in this book was to try to develop a kind of organizational chart of CCP overseas influence organizations and how they link back to the structure of influence in China. So I'll hold it up for the viewers to get a sense of across this way. So you see this is China United Front organizations and structures up here, and below this line here, I'm trying to do this kind of against the mirror image, are the matching organizations in a country like Australia. So if you read across,
I'll give you the floor for a minute, so you.
Oh, okay. So across the bottom here, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. You can see business groups, alumni associations, hometown associations, Chinese language media, Chinese students organizations, and sister city relationships. So all of these are part of the broad United Front network, which are used in a country like Australia to infiltrate the institutions and the organizations in Australia as a way of advancing the CCP's interests and influence. So it's a huge topic, but it's really, you cannot understand CCP and what it's doing abroad without having some grasp of the United Front and how it works.
What about the Confucius centres? Are they innocent centres of cultural and linguistic exchange?
Well, I mean, that's the public story, and there are plenty of universities in Australia that have fallen for that, and despite all the evidence, continue to believe it. I should say that the scales have fallen from the eyes of many university administrators in the United States, and they're being closed down one after. There are some dozens of them in the US have now been closed down. And the reason they've been closed down is that people are starting to wake up to what they really are. And if you read the Chinese language literature and what the party actually says about the Confucius Institutes, you realize that the party, in private, as it were, says, as one senior leader did several years ago, Confucius Institutes are a fundamental part of the Communist Party's ideological what's the phrase? Ideological setup. And so they see them very distinctly as influence and interference organisations. And there have been a series of reports that have come out around the place in Europe, for instance, where people working at Confucius Institutes have been exposed as MSS agents. In other words, they're engaged in espionage and using the Confucius Institute as cover. So it really is astonishing that what ought to be the centres of free speech in the Western world, and that is our universities, I mean, that's isn't that their fundamental principle, should be hosting these organisations which are controlled by Beijing. They set the curricula, they choose the staff, they monitor them, they appoint the directors, they provide some of the funding. And so you have, for example, all kinds of nefarious things going on at the University of Queensland, which is arguably the most infiltrated university. If you look at the case of Drew Pavlou, which has been extraordinarily revelatory about how elites are captured, groomed, I think is a good word for them. The Confucius Institute there has helped develop courses in economics where they, have students are asked to discuss questions like, are in effect, are Uyghurs terrorists? I mean, it's ideological education, pure and simple. But the university tolerates this. And so, interestingly... And
so do the academic staff organisations and student groups. That's
I cannot help but draw a contrast between the extraordinary uproar on the campuses about the Ramsay centres, which are, we want students to read the great books of Western civilization, versus Confucius Institutes, which are controlled by and advance the interests of an authoritarian foreign power. And yet the academics and the academic organisations are, with very few exceptions, John Fitzgerald, Kevin Carrico, or a couple of those exceptions that come to mind, have nothing to say. I don't think that's a problem, because they're also terrified. They're so terrified of being accused of being racist. And I just think this is such a moral failure on the part of our academic community.
Okay, finally, Clive, what's to be done, to use that old Leninist phrase?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you are. I mean, what's interesting, a couple of times I've been to the United States to talk about this stuff, and you realise just how differently they think about the role of the United States in the global community as the kind of superpower and accustomed to engineering regime changes around the world and so on. They think about this completely differently. But if you're a middle power like Australia, where, thinking about engineering regime change in Beijing was just an absurdity and asking for trouble, no, what we need to do is to set up defences against the CCP influence in Australia. And that's what the federal government has been doing very much in a world-leading way for the last 3 years. And it came about as a result of Malcolm Turnbull's sudden realisation. He went from a China dove to a China hawk, partly as a result of intelligence advice, partly as a result of the newspaper stories, partly as a result of having one or two very good advisors who got China. And so Australia has established a number of laws, the Foreign Interference Law, the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, the Critical Infrastructure Scheme, beefing up the FIRB, new laws which have barely commented on protecting telecommunications from foreign interference, and also a range of administrative measures. But above all, I always say this, the most important thing is how civil society responds to this. And that depends above all on shedding light on what the CCP is doing. CCP loves to operate in the shadows, despite all the noisy propaganda. It's what's happening in the shadows that really matters. And shedding light on it through good journalism, through books, is the way to alert civil society in a way that allows it to defend itself against CCP influence in the institutions to which citizens belong. So that's what we're doing in Australia, and that's why many other countries are very interested in what's happening here, because some countries are becoming more and more aware that this is a massive problem. It's why, for example, Silent Invasion was published in Japan in Japanese 2 months ago and was suddenly this massive bestseller. I mean, shocking. Why? But turns out in Japan, there's a widespread understanding that CCP influence is a huge problem they've got to deal with somehow. And so Silent Invasion becomes a kind of handbook for the public to understand the kind of techniques being used.
Okay, well, I should say that there are links if you want to order either of or both of Clive's books. I've got links to the ordering page for both of them down in the description section below the video, and Clive will be pleased to hear that the link is to Booktopia, not Amazon. You can go to a genuine Aussie book distributor to get them. So I'd urge, there's an awful lot. Clive's only been able to scratch the surface today, but I strongly recommend you get both of these books. Okay, so let's go to a few chat comments. I think we're only going to scratch the surface of this, but anyway, let's start with this one. Peter Crawford, wouldn't a Chinese majority population, irrespective of where they came from in China or the diaspora, have major sympathies with the government of China?
Well, Peter, perhaps you might like to go to Xinjiang and put that question to the Uyghur people. Or perhaps you might like to go to Hong Kong and put that question to the millions of people who marched in the streets, people of Chinese heritage, to protect the democratic freedoms they had. Or perhaps you'd like to go to Taiwan, full of people of Chinese heritage, and say, well, you know, you're Chinese, you're probably sympathetic to the Chinese government, aren't you? I mean, really, I mean, it's a kind of racist view that embedded in that Chinese people are somehow like authoritarianism, or, you know, they're Confucian, and so they have a kind of veneration for authority or something like that. No, Chinese people, like people, Italians or Australians or anyone, they have a huge political diversity in their views. What is different about Chinese people in China and sadly elsewhere is that the views that they are exposed to are highly circumscribed by what is undoubtedly the most effective silencing and system of crushing free speech and free thought. You know, there was even on Beijing University, Peking University, I should say, because they stick to that old name. There were after Liu Xiaobo died, the dissident writer who won the Nobel Peace Prize, the video cameras were being used to monitor the facial expressions of students, and anyone who was looking particularly sad or despondent on the day after he died was regarded with suspicion. So let's not fall for this Confucianism or authoritarianism is in the genes of Chinese people. I mean, truly, this is about democracy. It's about freedom of speech, fundamental universal human rights. And everybody, you know, if some people would prefer to live under a dictatorship, and I'm sure there are some, then, you know, fine. But don't impose that on everyone else who enjoys some degree of freedom, please.
Just thinking, Peter, in my mailbox there was a copy of Epoch Times, How the Communist Party Endangered the World. Not sure if anyone else received it. I mean, you want to make a comment on Falun Gong and all that? I think that's a Falun Gong publication, isn't it?
It is a Falun Gong publication. Yeah, look, there's a real problem with the Epoch Times. And that's because, you know, it has been a really interesting, if not always reliable, newspaper, and you'd never use it as a primary credible source, but they have in the past contained a lot of very interesting, and in some cases with some of their journalists, and some of their journalists are very good people, some very insightful and well-informed articles. But they've made a huge mistake in the last 18 months or so in the United States, and this has spilled over into Australia, and that is they've become fanatically pro-Trump. And, you know, that whoever makes the decisions for the Epoch Times has decided that Trump is pushing back hard against the CCP. He's great, therefore whatever Donald Trump says must be right, and so we're going to put our resources into backing him. And that's a massive mistake for a number of reasons. One is they start to recycle kind of conspiracy theories about Trump to try and expose, you know, all kinds of ridiculous things. They start to publish climate science denial articles. I mean, I was a couple of years ago, you know, reasonably sympathetic. I didn't think it was a very reliable journal of record, but I understood and I'm sympathetic towards the Falun Gong, who are probably the most persecuted people by the Chinese Communist Party, certainly in the last 30 years. I mean, brutal persecution.
Shocking organ harvesting stuff.
Yeah, which is now very well established. So Falun Gong prisoners kept alive, fed, medicated, so that they can be killed and have their organs removed to be sold on the free market, you know, on the market. So, yeah, so the Epoch Times has really, I think, made a bad political mistake because, you know, in the United States, the pushback against Beijing, China, is the only strongly bipartisan thing around. I mean, the Democrats are just as strong as the Republicans on pushing back against China in all its manifestations. In fact, in some ways stronger, because Trump has been inconsistent on certain things like Huawei, whereas the Democrats have been far more consistent about excluding Huawei and not allowing it to gain influence in the telecommunication networks around the world, etc., etc. And so, just to add a final point on this, I'm confident that if the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party had a vote at the forthcoming US presidential election, they would vote for Donald Trump. Because although Trump is the president that's pushed back, he operates far more in their interests. He's corruptible, he's inconsistent, he will do a deal which will which will overrule whatever he's done before. He does not believe in human rights. And above all, he has undermined the Western alliance and shattered it, really. If you go to Europe, the anger at the United States under Trump is huge, and that has been a godsend for Xi Jinping and the CCP. So Joe Biden, who has his own China problems in the past, China appeasement problems, I think if he were a Democrat president and he were responding to the party's demand to push back in the same kind of way, but did it in a strategic, carefully thought through way, and bringing in the allies to have a united front, as it were, pushback against Beijing's intrusions and influence, that is a far greater threat to Beijing than a Donald Trump.
Okay, Andrews Hex. Thanks, Clive, for the truth about the CCP. Question 1, is Australia's economic, cultural, political and educational enmeshment with China incompatible with maintaining Australia's sovereignty?
Well, thanks. It's a crucial question. Well, I mean, short answer is no, it's not. It depends on how extensive CCP influence and interference is and becomes. I mean, when you have, for example, senior politicians, federally and state, who have effectively become mouthpieces for CCP ideology, and some of them have in a kind of blatant way, whether they believe, there are not too many believe it as an ideological point of view, but we saw it happen to Sam Dastyari. He started mouthing CCP propaganda because a donor gave him a lot of money for the party, and he had his personal bills paid by some, nice Chinese wealthy friends, or Chinese Australian in one case, Chinese in another case. We've seen what's happened with Musselman, who was just a parrot of CCP propaganda. You read what he said; it's quite shocking. But they're not the main worries. They're the more subtle ones who are not silly enough to say it out loud. So CCP has had a lot of influence over many politicians, particularly in the Labor Party. It is a real problem for the Labor Party. And I tell you what, there are some senior people in the Labor Party who are deeply disturbed by this and are doing their best to root out this influence from the party, but it's very deep. If you look at Daniel Andrews in Victoria, for example, signing up to the Belt and Road Agreement. So yes, it really is a serious potential threat to Australia's sovereignty. But the good news is that we have begun a process of firmly and consistently pushing back in various areas. And so I think that, and there's been a great deal of increase in understanding on the part of the Australian public and strong support for this pushback, which of course matters a lot. So I think that, I'm more optimistic now than I was about the capacity of Australia to resist these attempts to undermine our sovereignty.
Okay. What's this one? Cherie, it depends on what. I think that's a reference to back to an earlier question. So I might just move on from that one. Dale Turner, Is the Chinese Party influence comparable to the USSR influence in Australia in the 1950s? I'm thinking about Petrov and other parts of the ALP.
Mm. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think about this quite a lot. The nature of the influence is very different, because if you think back to the Cold War Soviet influence days in Australia, the way the Soviet Union exerted its influence was, first of all, not through economic power. I mean, we had virtually no trade or investment links with the Soviet Union, so it didn't have that. It was through espionage to some degree, hence Petrov, but more particularly, it was through the power and influence of fellow travellers and Communist Party members, secret and otherwise. So the influence of the Soviet Union was really through those fellow travellers, and I'm sure there are plenty of us, you know, on the screen and watching, who can remember those days. And there was a great deal of sympathy on the part of people from the left who weren't members of the Communist Party, but nevertheless thought that the Soviet Union was a very important bulwark against the power of the United States. And it was through that kind of influence that the Soviet Union, directly through the Communist Party of Australia, but also through a broader kind of left constituency, people who actively believed in socialism wanted to promote it in Australia, that the Soviet Union, or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, had influence in this country. But the CCP is very different. There are very, very few people, certainly in the mainstream community, that believe in the ideology of the CCP, you know, that want to promote Xi Jinping thought. But there are a lot of fellow travellers, one way or another. They're business people and they're, you know, university vice chancellors and so on, who have been persuaded through money, one way or another, that it's in their interest and that of their institutions to be nice to Beijing and to actively speak the language and promote the broader interests of the Chinese Communist Party. People who've been groomed over many periods, over a long period, using sophisticated psychological techniques to see the world the way the Chinese Communist Party does, and therefore to speak and act on its behalf. And so, and then of course there's the diaspora, and there's a substantial fraction of the diaspora, again impossible to say, who actively work on behalf of the CCP, but only a fraction of that fraction actually do so for ideological reasons. When I talk to my Chinese Australian friends about, and colleagues and associates about this, you know, they're quite insistent that very few of them are actually party members and really believe it. Well, they might be party members but don't really believe it. They do it for self-interest because they're going to make money and have status as a result. So it's a more complicated situation now.
Okay, considering the 2020 US presidential election, do you think China will invade Taiwan around that time, and what do you think will be the response from Biden or Trump?
Thanks for that one, Noel. Yeah, I've heard it suggested that the day after the presidential election, which is, I think, is that November the 4th, you know, there'll be an election result. If it's Biden, there will be a 2 to 3 month kind of interregnum when Biden's not the president and Trump will be raging around. And it would be, from a military point of view, kind of a unique opportunity for China to invade Taiwan. And they've been definitely getting very, very aggressive towards Taiwan in recent months, with, you know, sending fighter jets and bombers to, you know, encircle the island, making increasingly aggressive noises, kind of psyching each other up within top of the party and the military to, you know, to be ready for an invasion, enraged at the re-election of President Tsai because she's, unlike the opposition, not is disposed towards a more independent stance. And from an internal China politics point of view, the issue of Taiwan is a really red hot one. The party has stoked over 30 years from 1989, when it decided it wasn't going to be an internationalist party anymore, but one cultivating nationalist sentiment. There's an expectation that China will take back the province of Taiwan at some point. So it's a very dangerous prospect, very dangerous, and a lot of people worried. And I think the CCP would bank on the US not responding in a military way. But the Taiwanese, it could easily turn into the mainland's Vietnam. Taiwan has the capacity to inflict serious damage. I mean, they would lose. They can't resist an invasion. That's just overwhelming force. But they would cause enormous damage in the process, in the weeks that it took to take over. And who knows what kinds of cyber weapons Taipei might have. So it's a very dangerous and unpredictable situation. But you're right to be worried about it.
Cherie Wax, have you personally had threats, whether overt, covert or implied, apart from the issue of actual publication?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Put it this way, when the book Silent Invasion came out in February 2018, all kinds of weird and unpleasant and unsettling things happened in the cyber world in particular. My computers were screwed, basically. And then I had people turning up of a spooky disposition to give me counter-surveillance advice. I didn't really want to hear, but I'd been persuaded that I actually needed it. And there was news coming from across the ditch where, in a way, my counterpart, although one with much more experience and knowledge and background than me, Professor Anne-Marie Brady, she had her office burgled and then her home burgled by people who had no interest in stealing valuables, but only computers and USBs, and looked very much like, and New Zealand's intelligence services agreed, like a CCP organised pair of burglaries. I mean, this definitely put the wind up me and people around me. The building that I work in, which is on Charles Sturt University's Canberra theology campus, was a very kind of open building that people wandered in and out of at will. It suddenly, as on advice from the managers and the AFP, went into lockdown. Swipe cards, cameras, whole box and dice. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely a problem. And in the early months, I was so resentful about this. I thought, I'm an academic in a free democratic country that wrote a book. Why should I be enduring these threats and this intimidation? It is attempt to silence me and drive me out of public discussion. I was so resentful about it. I thought, what's my country come to? But then after a few months, I realized that's what my country had come to. And it's not just me. There are some very disturbing stories. I mentioned the Hortons. John Garno has had worse than I have. Anne-Marie Brady has had serious problems in New Zealand. There have been, if you look what's happened to Drew Pavlou, the pro-democracy student on the University.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary story.
Oh, I mean, I would not think this could happen in Australia, but it's happening. So, yeah. And I'm sure a lot of people are remaining silent, not least half of the China scholar community, because they're scared of these kinds of threats and intimidation.
Cherie has another one about Taiwan. I think we've probably covered that. We're not going to scratch the surface of the chat. So, Philip Lamb, clearly speech is not free at all everywhere. Your speaker is paid. Charles Dickens was castigated on his first tour of the USA for his critique of a lack of international copyright laws being paid. Do you want to comment on that? Or
Not sure what the question is.
It was more a statement than a question.
Fair enough.
Anthony Carr. Can you estimate the proportion of Australians of Chinese extraction who would support Beijing rather than Australia in any dispute? That's a tough one.
You know, of all the attacks that were made on me after Silent Invasion came out, it was an attempt to make such an estimate that got me into most trouble. I didn't make an estimate, and it's impossible to know, but I did ask her. I was having dinner with a bunch of Chinese Australian friends, obviously pro-democracy people, and I asked them to make estimates, and they all had different numbers. And so, you know, I put them in the book, and people went ballistic. You know, I was saying, you know, all Chinese Australians are traitors. Oh, it's not what I said in the least. Just go check the book. Talk to Chinese Australians. You know, my advice would be talk to Chinese Australians and ask them what they think. And you'll get a whole bunch of different views. I don't know. I'd say it's a significant proportion. Maybe it's a small proportion. I don't know. There are, one indicator is when there was the Hague ruling on the South China Sea, the International Tribunal said that China's claims to the South China Sea had zero basis in international law. A large number of Chinese Australian community groups, some hundreds of them, signed a petition attacking the Hague ruling and saying that China does have a legitimate claim to the South China Sea. So there are a lot willing to come out and say, no, we think China is right, even though the International Legal Tribunal said it was wrong. And there were demonstrations in the streets and so on of several hundred people. So, yeah, just kind of vague ideas of, you know, what might be there. It's very hard to say, very hard to say.
Okay, now, Clive, you indicated, I think you probably need to go about now. Is that?
I'm happy to take one or two more questions, Peter. Since
all right. Now, we've got a number of comments rather than questions here. So I'll try and get to the next question. But particularly by somebody who hasn't already had a question. Chantal Marie Smith. I don't think the average person living in China actually feels their government speaks for them. And by average person, I mean blue collar and lesser workers, such as those working in factories. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, a number of things kind of come to mind. Obviously, there's been a long-running process of extraordinary indoctrination. Particularly since 1989, as I detailed in Silent Invasion, the party decided to have a really sustained process of political indoctrination, I mean, far more intense than anything since the Cultural Revolution. So that every child from the day he or she is born received just kind of blanket indoctrination, and a highly distorted view of history, so that, you know, the majority of Chinese students who come to Australia to study have never heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre, just don't know about it. So, and yet that was probably the defining event of Chinese history for the last 50 years. So, and it depends on what you mean by the Chinese Communist Party. It's often, you often hear Chinese people say, I support the Chinese Communist Party and our leaders in Beijing, but, you know, these local officials, they just kind of got it all wrong, and they're corrupt and they're oppressive and they're hopeless and they don't care for the people. Now, of course, the local officials, you know, they're controlled from Beijing. If they step out of line, they're punished by Beijing. They sit there and do nothing, often for a long time, because they haven't had instructions from Beijing. And all this came together in Wuhan in February this year, where there was a huge amount of anger from the citizens of Wuhan against the government, local authorities and beyond, because of the way they were screwing up the management of the outbreak of the COVID-19 epidemic. And, you know, there was extreme distress and suffering in Wuhan. mostly it hasn't really been revealed, or it hasn't come out yet, just how bad it was in Wuhan. And there was enormous anger from the people against the government, the local authorities, and going up to the top of the party. And so, for example, and it was all over social media, and there was lots of criticism, and then towards the end of January, the party realised things. They liked to allow the people to vent at certain times. So they allowed them to vent on social media, and then they decided had enough and cracked down, and the whole thing was brought under control. And the people who had been most threatening, like citizen journalists who'd gone out with their cameras and gone to hospitals and posting it, they were arrested and gone. But then a senior official arrived to inspect what was going on in Wuhan, and he went to, he was taken to a kind of housing estate with high rises and so on, and he was being shown around by local officials. And many of the residents who lived there came out onto their balconies and started heckling this guy and saying, fake, get out of here, you bastards, or words to that effect. So at times there's enormous anger towards the party, but it's also true that there's a great deal of very intense patriotic feeling in some segments of the Chinese community, and they very strongly support the Chinese government. So it's a complicated story, as politics always is.
Turner, is anyone contemplating an action under Section 18C, finding the book offensive? Don't give people ideas.
I've never heard that suggested. There's definitely an issue of defamation law being used as a way of suppressing the book or creating trouble for the publisher and indeed the authors, in this case, as it was with Silent Invasion. In fact, the primary reason cited by Allen and Unwin for deciding not to publish Silent Invasion was the fear of vexatious defamation suits. You know, Chinese or Chinese-Australian billionaire, so obviously with deep pockets, either under instructions from the party, the embassy, for instance, or taking a view that of acting independently in a way that would win brownie points in Beijing, may well have decided to launch a defamation action against the publisher and the author, even if there's no prospect of winning, knowing that it could cause enormous commercial cost to the publisher because it ties you up in the courts for a year or two. You can run up a bill of $300,000 or $400,000. If you win, you might only get half of it back. In the meantime, you've allocated 6 people in the company to do nothing else but defend this case. So it can be a huge deterrent, and it's known as lawfare, and it's one of the well-defined techniques of hybrid warfare. There's cyber war.
Using our own institutional structures against
precisely using democracy to undermine democracy. So that was Alan Unwin's main fear, and it could always happen. It could be someone who's not particularly well off, but who suddenly finds a banker willing to finance their legal action. And after Silent Invasion was published by Hardy Grant in Melbourne, I mean, they did gingerly pick up their mail each day for a few months after it came out to see whether there might be any letters from lawyers. And of course, this book, Hidden Hand, is now being subject. The Northern Hemisphere publisher of it, One World in London, publishing in the UK and the US, has been threatened with legal action by one of the persons and groups mentioned in it because they claim that the book defames them, and so this has required One World to respond. The story has been taken up very vigorously by the newspapers in Britain. This last week in the Times, there were 3 very strong stories about this legal threat, and that was picked up by other papers, the Daily Mail, the Express. It's also reported in the Globe and Mail in Canada. So it became a significant media issue. We don't anticipate that any legal action from those people will be taken because they have no case whatever. I mean, it was a ridiculous threat. So yeah, we're not worried about any legal case being taken on a legitimate basis, but there's always the concern that it might be done for vexatious reasons.
What's the saying? The process is the punishment.
Yeah.
Very true. Well, I think we'll probably have to wind up at that point. Clive's gone 10 minutes over what was his preferred time for this, so thanks very much, Clive. That was a real a great performance there, and I'd urge anybody who's interested in this to order Clive's books, and as I said, there are links to the order page in the description section below. So thanks to everybody who's participated. As usual, apologies to those who posted on chat that we didn't get to. I think we got about a third of the way through the chat entries today, but that's always seems to be the way. Thanks very much to Clive in particular. It was a very courageous act in getting these books out, and a tremendous effort to produce this very comprehensive picture of what we're up against here. So with that, I will now end the broadcast.
Thanks, Peter. That's terrific, and thanks everyone for coming to have a look.
Right. Okay.